This morning is an Intangible Cultural Heritage session. My name's Alexandra Hill. I'm the co-convener of the Australia ICOMOS National Scientific Committee on Intangible Cultural Heritage, and we're presenting this panel discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to note that this session is being videoed. You won't be identifiable unless you turn around or you ask a question during the question time at the end. I would also like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, who've been the traditional owners of this part of southwest Western Australia for over 45,000 years. I will pay my respect to them, thank them for allowing us to meet today on country, and acknowledge all other traditional owners and First Nations peoples who are with us today. Now, today we'll be looking at how we manage the relationship between intangible cultural heritage and its interaction with the physical heritage space. In his keynote address yesterday, Ken Wyatt articulated the multidimensional nature of ICH as it manifests in songlines, cultural practice and knowledge systems across terrestrial, aerial and aquatic environments. Our panel today will explore how we recognise and appropriately engage with values and rights of communities regarding their ICH, and particularly how Indigenous cultural and intellectual property and the unique rights and values of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are incorporated into protections and understandings of place. So as not to disrupt the flow of the discussion this morning, I will introduce our speakers now and outline what they will be talking about. Our first speaker is Chris Johnston, well known to many of us as the founding member of the National Scientific Committee on Intangible Cultural Heritage, co-editor of the Australia ICOMOS Practice Note on ICH in Place, and she has led Australia ICOMOS's response to drafts of the ICOMOS proposed charter on ICH. She's the founder of Context, now part of the GML Heritage Group, and an honorary research associate at La Trobe University. Sorry about that. Chris will take us through the draft international charter and guidance on sites with intangible cultural heritage. Following this firm grounding in how ICOMOS globally as a community is considering intangible cultural heritage, we'll have a panel discussion on aspects of intangible cultural heritage and its application in Australia, particularly regarding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rights and values. Starting this discussion will be Jamie Lowe, who's in the middle with a hat, who's a Gunditj Mara Djabbarung man from southeastern Victoria and CEO of the National Native Title Council. Jamie is also the NNT representative on the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and a joint council member of the Coalition of Peaks, through which he was instrumental in the closing the gap agreement with the federal government. Jamie will discuss First Nations rights and how they are recognised in management of intangible cultural heritage. Gareth Ogilvie, on your right, will then lead us in talking about the increasing pressure on Sea Country intangible cultural heritage and rights. Gareth is the Executive Officer for the Bardi and Jawi Namidaman Prescribed Body Corporate in the West Kimberley and Co-Chair of the Sea Country Alliance. He is a Yamaji Nanda man and lawyer, formerly with the Commonwealth Attorney General's Department, before moving on to work as a native title lawyer at the Kimberley Land Council. Finally, Dr. Matthew Story, in the middle, will explore intangible cultural heritage and intellectual property and a rights-based approach to intangible cultural heritage. Matthew is the legal principal and director at Story and Ward Lawyers and former associate professor and head of law at Charles Darwin University. He is also the former director of the Office of the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council at the Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet, former CEO at First Nations Legal and Research Services, which was the Native Title Services Victoria, and was CEO of the National Native Title Council. Now, I'll pass you over to Chris to go through these.
Thanks for this opportunity. I'd like to reiterate Alex's recognition of the elders of the country that we're meeting on today, the Whadjuk Noongar Nation, and I would like to acknowledge the elders of the country that I've lived on and currently work on. I was born and raised on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, and I live on Jara country now. And I acknowledge the strength and resilience and the inspiration from those traditional owners. I want to talk about the charter that's about to go to the GA in Brazil, one of the in-between GAs not the big ones like we had in Sydney. Since UNESCO adopted its Convention on the Intangible Cultural Heritage in 2003, there's been much debate within ICOMOS about the connections between intangible cultural heritage and tangible, what we call place, and objects. In November, at the ICOMOS Annual General Assembly in Brazil, it's anticipated, I say with fingers crossed, that ICOMOS will adopt for the first time an international charter and guidance on sites with intangible cultural heritage. In this short presentation, I'm going to briefly cover the history of this new charter. It's rather a long history, but I won't bore you with the details. I'll look at how a charter might help advance heritage practice, Australia ICOMOS's role, and a few considerations looking forward. And I think they'll be expanded as the panel discusses some of the issues that Alex has already highlighted. So in 2014, Australia ICOMOS established a National Scientific Committee on ICH, and in 2007 adopted a practice note developed by that committee on intangible cultural heritage and place. With that foundation, Australia ICOMOS made extensive comments, quite critical comments, on a draft ICOMOS ICH charter that was circulated in 2020. And as a result, the ICOMOS board referred the charter back for revision through a working group, and that was headed by Andrew Hall from ICOMOS South Australia, one of the founders of ICOMOS's International Scientific Committee, which is called ICICH. So a lot of short things in here, but ICH and ICICH will do you for this talk. So Andrew was one of the founders of the ISC, and he led a working group to consider Australia's comments in particular, although comments more widely as well. And I was appointed as Australia ICOMOS's representative on the working group. So both Andrew and myself were the new people on the working group. The others had been working on the draft charter, I might say, for some very long time. So how do we manage the relationship between ICH and its interaction with the physical heritage place and the objects, the settings, all of those things? What tools or guidance do we need? How do we ensure that the values of our many different communities and groups, First Nations people through to the most recent arrivals, are actually recognised and incorporated into understandings of place and protection of both tangible and intangible attributes? So the focus in this charter, as you'll see, is on place, or sites as it uses that term. And so while ICH, I think we'd agree from our conversations yesterday, is an essential part of understanding cultural heritage, it's still a relatively new area of practice for many in the heritage professions. Just over 20 years ago, ICOMOS recognised the need to formulate a position on ICH, starting with the Kimberley Declaration on ICH at the Victoria Falls General Assembly in 2003 in Zimbabwe, the establishment of the International Scientific Committee, ICICH, also in the same year, the Quebec Declaration on the Spirit of Place, and ICICH's first go really at this work with the Tenmening Declaration in 2007. The latter becoming and being the basis for the subsequent efforts to produce a charter. You can see it's been a long journey, and especially for some people, and I'll mention one of them in a moment. Through its system of charters and other guidance documents, ICOMOS is really uniquely placed to provide a statement that guides and clarifies practice in the place-based heritage space, and provides much needed direction to ICOMOS members through its multitude really of doctrine that's around, and in this case, especially in relation to ICH. So do we need a charter? That's a key question when you're thinking about the amount of doctrine. For those of you that are long-standing ICOMOS members, you'd be aware of how much doctrine, I should say, out there. So do we need a charter? Well, ICH is still a relatively new area of practice. many of us who work in that area are still new in the area. We need some guidance, we need some help. We lack skills and experience, and we're gaining it rapidly. And there's some very complex, I think, interactions between tangible and intangible heritage, and a lot of it is not well dealt with now if you look at heritage listings. I think our conversation this morning is going to be really important in that regard. So it's with those kinds of things in mind that ICOMOS has continued to support the development of a charter, even though for ICIC, ICOMOS's expert body, this has been a long haul, 20 years. 20 years. Whew. Many challenges. Marilyn Truscott, a long-standing and highly regarded member of Australia ICOMOS and ICIC, has been a key driver advocating the need for a charter. And I'd like to just acknowledge Marilyn and her long work as a driver in that field. Now, I'll just highlight a few aspects of the charter that will go up, I hope, for approval at the GA. Firstly, the purposes of the Charter, and I might just highlight the middle one, especially given the audience in the room. So, of course, it's to advocate for the recognition of ICH as an integral part of site-based or place-based heritage. But importantly, it's to support and guide us. Part of its aim is really for us, and it's said really very clearly at the start of the Charter that that's its purpose. And it's to align our work with the International Convention. Not that this charter is a guide to how we implement that convention, that's not our work to do. But we need to work with it and acknowledge its limitations, and acknowledge that Australia's not a signatory. The Charter's got 6 specific objectives, which I've paraphrased here. I won't read all of them, but it really is trying to connect the tangible, intangible, to say, actually, they've never been split, they're all connected. It's to confirm that we as heritage professionals, as people working in the field, as advocates for heritage, really have an obligation to ensure the values and attributes of ICH connected to a place are safeguarded. And it establishes ethical aspects of practice, because ICH is not ours. We might like it to be, but it's not. It's owned and by the community that for whom it is part of their living heritage. And so it sets out some principles around that. It also recognises on point 6 that damage to the ICH, damage to the fabric, it's all integrated, both impact each other in so many ways, and that I think that's one of the aspects of heritage practice that frustrates me greatly, is that often ICH is completely left out of our heritage listings. Anyway, enough from me. The Charter recognises and seeks to respond to the many impacts facing ICH today. Globalisation, development processes, tourism, climate change, forced migration, exclusion of communities from decision-making about their ICH and significant places. The list really does go on. It also seeks to acknowledge current perspectives that we're working with in cultural heritage, such as the nature-culture reintegration, such as rights-based approaches, such as free, prior and informed consent. And so one of the challenges of writing a charter like this has been to navigate around the many different ways that ICH is recognised by individual countries and legal jurisdictions. Some are signatories to the 2003 Convention, some are not, like Australia. There are political and cultural sensitivities as well, and to be successful, an international charter needs to navigate these differences so it can provide a framework of principles and not be prescriptive, to guide and suggest, to leave space for local and regional responses, like the kinds of responses that we might make. The Charter sets out and expands on 3 principles. I'll leave them there. The first one is critical, that communities are the custodians and they have the right to control knowledge related to the use, access of their cultural heritage in all aspects. and who represents them in those processes. Sight may be integral. The role of heritage professionals is one of support, assist, sometimes just go away and leave communities to it. Who laughed? I've been told to go away. I have always done that. Another challenge for this charter has been that we thought it needed guidance, and charters usually don't have guidance. ICOMOS has rules about the lengths of charters, and this one exceeds those lengths because we've included guidance as a component. And why do we need guidance? Well, because it's a new area. So the charter, when you finally get to see it, will include these kind of areas of guidance. So it's called a charter and guidance. That just really reflects the limited exposure of many heritage professionals. And for Australia now, well, we're reflected, I guess, in the charter in that we need to do our own thing. We have a practice note already, but what do we want to do with the things that we're working with, the tools that we have? As I mentioned that before, that we need to think about what works for us and what we need. We work with the Borough Charter, the practice notes, etc. Do we need to review those things? Do we need to develop new documents, new guidance, adopt guidance that's been developed by others? What do we need to work in an Australian context into the future? So for ICOMOS and the international ICOMOS community, a charter will not be enough. We will need other things to really help people. You know, charters are not exciting reading, really. I'm sorry to tell you that. That's bad news, I know. But we need other kinds of guidance that are very, very practical, very friendly. And there's a few kind of hints up there about things that Australia ICOMOS has boldly suggested to ICICH as possibilities for their work after the charter is adopted. And in Australia, we made a number of submissions on drafts of the charter, and we identified in our last submission 2 topics that will be really important, and one of them is very much the focus for today. So it's guidance on how we can work more effectively and acknowledge First Nations people, recognise their inherent authority over ownership of their cultural heritage, and engage with an understanding of that heritage as inseparable, not split into different components, and so connected to the complexity of intangible cultural heritage. Perhaps I should add a third thing to what I was going to say. So my second one is that our practice here often focuses on the fabric of the place. I think you've all heard that one before. And it fails to protect and recognise the intangible cultural heritage. That's also true of community attachment to place, social significance, which is often not documented nor able to be protected. We need to shift the dial on some of those things. And maybe thirdly, we're not signatories to the convention. If we were, what would that mean? What might that change? And we might want to think about how that will work. I'd like to just close by acknowledging the members of the Charter Working Group that I've been working with: Andrew Hall, Uncle Cabez, Anna Lucia Ibanez, Munish Pandit, and I've already said Marilyn Truss-Scott. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion today, and I'm sure many other issues will come from our panellists in our discussion, so thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'll ask you, Jamie. So if we take a perspective that cultural rights are collectively owned, how do we provide a mechanism for decision-making on cultural heritage issues and intangible cultural heritage?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Chris. That was quite an insightful presentation. I'll just introduce myself again and acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people, the country we meet on today. My name's Jamie Lowe, Gunditjmara Djapurrung man from the southwest, but Perth resident. I got told during the week that 3 years you can actually be official WA, so I've been here for 3 years now, so now I'm an official, you know, the WA people have accepted me. I'm CEO of the National Native Title Council. The council also is a body that auspices and is a housing place for the Sea Country Alliance, which Gareth's the chair of. We also have within our remit the First Nations Heritage Protection Alliance. We've been negotiating with the Commonwealth Government on Commonwealth law reform now for 4 years, which Rachel Perkins is heading up along with me. So that's been quite a journey. And one of the I guess, the principles that we've been talking about, particularly from a Commonwealth perspective, is collective rights and how they are represented through First Nations bodies and how they represent the community. And I think, Chris, you pointed out that these are community values, and sure, individuals would have the knowledge, but they are community rights and collective rights, and something that we're trying to push through with the Commonwealth law reforms, that individuals at the moment, as we see in ATSIPA processes, can bring forth ATSIPA applications, sometimes against the actual collective community values as well. And so we're seeing that play out at the moment. I guess I'd like to point out a couple of points. As I guess it's somewhat ironic that you're seeing this debated around Indigenous intangible values through the media at the moment, particularly with the situation in Orange in New South Wales. Even just, I think it was yesterday, there was an article in The Australian and another view within The Guardian which debated, I guess, have put their views forward about First Nations people making up stories. And The Guardian had a counter view, of course, that these stories, that we need to believe in First Nations people, but they need to be through the vehicle of a collective institution. That's identified with UNDRIP, United Nations Rights of Indigenous People. Of course, we have rights as individuals, First Nations people, but these need to be directed through the vehicle of their choosing. And of course, within Australia, we have quite a complex tapestry of various statutory rights through Commonwealth and state legislation. We've got 275 PBCs across the country, prescribed body corporates, which hold the native title rights and facilitate the native title rights for native title holders, common law holders throughout the country, which covers probably about 50% of the nation. And other statutory bodies which also have the role of managing heritage within country, which we think would kind of push that, for example, down here in the southwest, the Noongar Agreement with the state, the 6 regional corporations, which are also charged with managing heritage on behalf of the Noongar people. And that covers probably about 80% of the country, and which has its own complexity, and we're advocating through the Commonwealth and also state government departments that these rights are further enhanced, that they are collective views held by the people and needs to be recognised within legislation. I guess the other ironic point that I'd like to make also, that we have this meeting today around intangible heritage within WA. And of course, we know that within the WA Aboriginal heritage legislation, that it doesn't actually recognise Indigenous intangible heritage within the legislation. It did within the previous, that the Act, that was the Act for about a month, and that was repealed, and the now old but new Act doesn't actually recognise, as a contentious point. So the state of WA still isn't recognising First Nations intangible heritage, and we know that they go hand in glove with physical sites. Physical sites don't exist without the intangible part for First Nations people in particular. It was quite a contentious point, and something that we tried to advocate through the WA government, and because of there's still a narrative, particularly within this state, and we're seeing this within the media at the moment, that Aboriginal people are still making up these stories. So I guess, Chris, with the charter and you spoke about and the convention, etc., we think it's critical, and with also within legislation throughout, and something that we're trying to kind of push the Commonwealth on is actually getting that recognised through Commonwealth legislation. So that would be kind of a blanket that would be recognised then throughout the country. So I'll probably just kind of hold it there, Alex, and I know we're going to get into some further discussion with the panel and some Q&A with the audience as well, and maybe just leave enough time for that.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. Gareth, your particular experience at the moment is regarding offshore and intangible cultural heritage there. If you want to go into that a bit.
Thanks, Alex. I'll also start by acknowledging the land on which we're gathering today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here in the room with us. Good morning, everyone. Good to see the terrific turnout on a Saturday morning. My name's Gareth Ogilvie. I'm the Executive Officer for the Bardi and Jawi Nimidaman Aboriginal Corporation. We're a PBC, so I've come from the northwest Kimberley on my way to Alice Springs. We've got a bit more activity happening next week. Has anyone been to One Arm Point? It's about a 2-hour drive. Just want to get an idea on who's been out that way. It's totally spectacular, that country. It's really special. It's about a 2-hour drive north of Broome, if you guys don't know where it is. Before the road, it was about a 6 to 7 hour drive up a dirt track. For just a bit of context for you guys, we got native title in 2010, but that litigation started in 1995, probably when I was at high school. So the litigation over that 15-year period obviously incorporated cultural values, stories of connection, not just to the land, but to the sea, to the islands, and the salt water surrounding that top end of the peninsula. That's no joke when we say there's essentially one big heritage site. There's the information that was provided to the court was restricted at different levels, whether that's by gender, by whoever's been initiated at the different levels. And I guess since then, that type of content has been incorporated into our healthy country plans, into joint management plans with the state government, and administered for different projects that we do. So I guess that's our background, and at the same time there's ongoing ceremony that's practiced each year. The sites within the native title determination area are only used at certain times for ceremony. They're not available to all men who practice those sites. So again, that's living and it's legit. So in terms of I guess existing pressures that we're facing, there was some recent litigation activity with the oil and gas industry and the Commonwealth Government. So there was a case called Tippa back at the end of 2022, and that reinterpreted environmental regulations at the Commonwealth level to say that all relevant people must be consulted, because the thing that's missing in these oil and gas companies' environmental plans is like the cultural impacts in terms of assessing how to respond to an oil spill or a natural disaster. So in terms of the question here, what the pressures are, we've got the pressure of meeting those deadlines for those oil and gas companies to submit their environmental plans to the Commonwealth Government. In terms of incorporating those cultural values into those plans is subject to certain protocols that we've been providing to the oil and gas industry. That's based on the free, prior and informed consent principle, and that's pretty much, we need to be free, have enough notice prior to consent to that process of consultation, so we have the ability to respond and incorporate those cultural values again. That's a serious burden. I'm the only employee to represent our 600 members and those cultural sites. And we have some traction, but I guess in terms of type of company it is, the status or the nature and scale of the project. It's just a really significant burden for us to deal with the limited resources that we have. So I guess obviously we're here today to try and incorporate what we can into legislative reform and whatever the proposed charter is. And I guess, yeah, we're leading that space given those interests and cultural values. So I can give you some examples. We've probably had about 10 PhDs published on Bardi and Jawi cultural values. Again, the precedent from the native title is cited in almost any native title activity, but that academic research goes to bush medicine, to language, to marine research, to bush tucker and all that sort of stuff. So it does exist. It is intangible, and yeah, pretty much that's, again, we push that content in any way we can to deal with pressures such as things that are put in front of us from the Commonwealth Government and the oil and gas industry.
Thanks, Gareth. Now, Matthew, we've talked about a charter, we've talked about the UN Declaration, we've talked about Indigenous cultural and intellectual property. What are the actual protections that we have in place for ICH?
Thanks, Alex. I'll also start off by acknowledging the Whadjuk Noongar people, the traditional owners of the country we're meeting on, and pay my particular acknowledgement to the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of Naarm, which is where I live and work and have come to you from today. You know, in the discussion about Indigenous intangible cultural heritage values, it's as somebody who's worked in the space for quite a while now, I just find it so annoying. You know, Jamie and I were talking to Richard just before about a war memorial in a New South Wales country town and the significance attached to that and the inscriptions of the men who had died in the Boer War and so on. I mean, we've all seen them. And you think about it, without the intangible values associated with that war memorial, it's a lump of stone. And yet we get this rubbish coming through the Australian, regurgitating the Hindmarsh Island disgrace and saying that intangible values are created. You know, it's just gammon, it's made up to prevent development. And you think about any aspect of physical heritage, it's only heritage because it's got that intangible value. And yet in this country and in this state in particular, we have to go through this rubbish time and time again. And when Jamie and I are working on the cultural reform, the biggest pushback we get from the conservative sectors, and I won't name them because that would be in politics, but you all know who they are. The biggest pushback, and I don't mean the mining industry, by the way, we get from the conservative sectors is, but what about intangible values? How do we know about intangible values? What are the, you know, you can't have this rubbish of intangible values. And it just gets me so furious that we are still in this country going through this rubbish when it comes to Indigenous peoples. Because as I say, if it's a war memorial in Bathurst, there's no doubt about its intangible values. And it's just that blunt racism that this country engages in time and time again. But that was just a prelude to talking about ICIP. Because the thing about ICIP, you see, we're talking about intangible values attached to a place. And most of the work Jamie and I do is on the intangible values attached to a place or a dreaming going into the sea or something like that. And it's place-based intangible cultural heritage. So that the issue with ICIP is, at least from a legal perspective, you're looking at intangible cultural heritage not attached to a place. Now, of course, that's a false dichotomy, essentially. I mean, the number of times, not just in Australia, I was in Sweden at an OECD conference listening to a Sami speaker talking about preservation of Sami language. And he was saying that the difficulty is the language is attached to the place. The language sings to the country where those reindeer are. And unless the Sami can get to that place, how can you keep the language alive? Because it's just meaningless. It becomes sort of Latin, and it has no life. And so to say we're separating ICIP from place-based intangible cultural heritage, or any place-based intangible heritage, is a completely false dichotomy. Language, design, art, song, all of those things that are normally within the grab bag of Indigenous cultural heritage is of course place-based. But we operate within a contemporary legal system, and the law regarding intellectual property is generally seen as separate from the law regarding real property, which is what I've spent most of my time doing at the university, that sort of thing. But so we've got this regime in Western law that separates intellectual property. And similarly, there needs to be a development of Western law to address issues where the current intellectual property legislation can't provide adequate regulation and protection for Indigenous cultural values. And where do those problems arise from? Well, part of it goes to, and this connects with what Jamie was saying, the very collective nature of this information and the ongoing nature of the information, the historic, from time immemorial until time unknowable. Because the basis of our intellectual property regime is, and there's nothing wrong with it, but it's designed to foster entrepreneurialism. So, this is why you have the lifespan attached to the patent. The inventor of the patent gets a monopoly right to reward them for the, for the innovation in creating the patent, but that passes over time. Well, if you talk, and same with copyright and things like that, but if you're talking about Indigenous ICIP, that's a tautology, if you're talking about ICIP, then of course the design has come from community and it goes on. And so you can't have a lifespan on it. And so that aspect of patent law is inappropriate. Similarly, if you're talking about, and often it's not generally appreciated within the ICIP space, is a lot of the work of bioprospecting and knowledge about environmental processes. And that's a knowledge that's been developed over time and not susceptible to a patent. You can't patent that and have it pass in 20 years and then go into the general domain. And so you need a specific regime to address so many of these things. And it's got to be a specific Commonwealth regime as well, because one of the constitutional oddities, it's not an oddity, it's just the way it is, one of the constitutional features of this country is that sort of legislation is really the preserve of the Commonwealth. So in Victoria at the Aboriginal Heritage Council, where Alex and I did some work, the state has passed intangible Indigenous cultural property legislation. The difficulty is, of course, that it's not really within the preserve of the state to do that. And so if somebody ever challenged that legislation, saying, well, I hold a Commonwealth copyright, then the Victorian state legislation is going to fold before it. And that's one of the reasons, apart from an intransigent bureaucracy, that legislation hasn't been particularly effective. Similarly, if you look at some of the bioprospecting legislation in place, and Queensland does have bioprospecting legislation, as does the Northern Territory, and there's some in the Commonwealth EPBC regulations around national parks. Leaving the Commonwealth aside, you see the two state ones do accrue rights to the traditional owners of the land that farmer companies get their bioprospecting discoveries from. But the contravention of the right is a criminal offence. What we're not doing is empowering traditional owners to use that knowledge in the modern economy. That's got to come from the Commonwealth. And just by the way, Western Australia was in the process of developing their bioprospecting legislation. And just around late 22, early 23, all of a sudden the discussion paper seems to have disappeared, and it seems the Western Australian government is no longer interested in advancing Indigenous cultural heritage legislation. So we will see. But there is prospects for some movement in the space. There are prospects internationally, and in Australia it was one of the recommendations in the Way Forward report that legislation been developed. There's been quite a bit of work on it through the Productivity Commission, and this government has a commitment, it says, to develop standalone ICIP legislation. The commitment is to start that off with fake art legislation. And of course, fake art legislation is, to a certain extent, and I don't mean this at all badly, I applaud them for doing the fake art legislation, but it's the sort of soft end of the market, isn't it? Because nobody likes overseas knockoffs of Aboriginal art, and so it's easy to sort of regulate in that. I imagine that it'll get a little bit more tetchy when you start talking about putting valuable property rights in genetic knowledge in the hands of traditional owners, but the fake art is a good start. The issue is, and this again connects to what Jamie's saying, even if you look at that sort of easy touch of legislating against fake art, if you're creating a property regime, you have to think, well, who's owning the property? Because, you know, the reason you have fake art is because somebody's breaching a copyright. What are you doing when you're breaching copyright? You're offending somebody's property right. And that's what copyright is. It's just a form of property. Well, who owns the property? Because really you've only got a few choices. You know, the state can own the property. And of course that happens with a lot of cultural heritage, Indigenous cultural heritage in particular. New South Wales regime is based on the Crown dispossessing not just the land but the cultural heritage as well. And so the state is an option. Individuals are an option, and that's what most of our property in Western law is based on. Or you can have a communal ownership. And of course, if you've got a communal ownership, which is reflective of the actual structures within Indigenous society around knowledge, if you've got that communal ownership, you've got to work out, well, who is that vested in? And in the submissions that I've been working on for the NNTC and some other traditional owner organisations, we're saying, well, there's actually a very obvious answer to that, because the intellectual property that we're talking about is connected to country. And as Jamie's been describing, across the country there is an extensive existing range of structures that are representative of the traditional owners who own the country from which stems the intellectual property. But that's a discussion that's yet to have, and as Ken Wyatt was saying this morning, that the appetite of this government, both in Western Australia and Commonwealth, the attitude of this government to engage in innovative, overdue legislative reform when it comes to Indigenous issues, cultural heritage and property in particular, seems to be fairly thin right at present. So the government's commitment to pass the fake art legislation before the election, which happened in May, I think is unlikely to be fulfilled. They are still in a process of developing ICIP legislation, and so hopefully that'll continue after the election, but it's hard to say at this stage. But there are significant international examples. I mean, the work that we were hearing about before, I think it was only last year, Mexico passed comprehensive Indigenous cultural and intellectual property legislation and addressed many of those issues with communal ownership. So there are, globally, Mexico. Globally, there are so many Mexican colleagues here in the room today. Globally, there are the move to address these situations, but in Australia, it's barren, frankly, and hopefully that will change because it's long overdue. Because when you think about it, in the meantime, it is just another further example of dispossession of Indigenous people's properties that this country has been based on. So it is overdue. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Always good to start off kicking. We're talking here about values and rights. So we're going to have a charter that's looking at values, but how do we manage that difference between community having intangible cultural heritage values associated with plates and traditional owners having rights to that intangible cultural heritage? Because there is, I believe, a difference in power dynamic there, and there should be, because it's rights versus values. But how do we manage that? I'm asking the panel. Well, because
Yeah.
my interest in this is that we're going to have an international charter
Yep.
that says that there are intangible cultural heritage values that are associated with place and that they should be considered when we're looking at heritage place and how it's managed. But traditional owners will have rights that are perhaps more important because they're rights than those of other community members who also have values. So how do we manage that?
Yes, that's really critical, isn't it? So when we're talking, I mean, I think all values are intangible, you know, they're held inside us human beings. And so we're talking about this thing called intangible cultural heritage. What a bloody mouthful, excuse me. I mean, don't you hate it, actually? Because it's all about heritage and it's all interconnected, and that's one of the big challenges for us in thinking about what are the values of this thing. It might be a place like a building that we're in now, or it might be a place like, I'm thinking about a place on the southwest coast in Victoria, which is really like where the whales transit. It's a huge place. It connects to many other peoples. We need to think, just as heritage professionals, way beyond that sense of place that we've worked with, even beyond that sense of cultural landscape, and really into this new way of understanding. So taking that and saying what are the values, then they're going to be complex. The term layered and not layered came up yesterday, and that wonderful watercolour image of values being layered, yes, or multiple and interwoven as well. So, there's not, for place, if I talk about this vast sea landscape of southwest Victoria where the whales are transiting, there's not just one set of values or one community with connections to that place. Even within Indigenous First Nations communities, there are many. So how do we start to shift our multiple values, multiple layers, and that implies there'll be conflict or difference, and then to take Alex's point, how do rights come into that, and how do we, and I don't have an answer to this except that rights are fundamental, they're kind of like the ground on which we should be standing, but how do we learn about and understand those rights as that fundamental ground? So that's sort of new learning for heritage professionals, I think.
I suppose focusing and picking up on the rights-based point, I mean, from a very legal background, the way I generally see it, and it goes to one of the points I was making, within our current legal system, it's the state who has evolved to be the protector, I hesitate to say owner, maybe the custodian of our heritage. And you can trace the development. If you look at the early development of some of the heritage laws, it was actually the private owner of property because there wasn't heritage legislation and such. And the private property owners of the castles in England were the one who protected, or not, their heritage values until there was legislation. And so you developed the notion that heritage is the patrimony of the nation and it's a state. But when it comes to Indigenous peoples, international law certainly recognises that Indigenous peoples have particular rights. And so while a right might have a state to own the resources within its boundaries, that right is in international law qualified by the rights of Indigenous peoples arising from their particular status as an Indigenous person. That raises an Indigenous group. That raises a whole interesting issue about notions of sovereignty and all sorts of things. But without diving into that rabbit hole, international law recognises the particular rights of Indigenous peoples when it comes to lands, when it comes to all sorts of things. It's really not a big step to recognise the particular rights of Indigenous peoples when it comes to cultural heritage. And that means, in answer to your question, yes, there are national values in heritage. Yes, there are national values in protecting cultural heritage. But those national values have to fit within a context of recognising the particular status of Indigenous peoples and their right to control their resources, which includes their cultural heritage.
Yeah, we know what our cultural values are, but there's been no lobbying to incorporate it into domestic or state legislation. Even the Greens and Labor government couldn't even incorporate it a few years ago when they were looking at UNDRIP. So I don't think there's any real appetite at the government level. From our point of view, heritage legislation is designed to circumvent Aboriginal heritage and find loopholes to make things more compliant, to cut through the black tape or red tape, however you want to call it. So despite the Commonwealth signing up to the UNDRIP treaty back in 2006, wasn't it, Matt? There's just been no movement whatsoever. Whereas, the private sector, they're pushing for it more from our point of view because I guess it's the ESG component, social licence, getting points on the share market and that sort of thing and trying to incorporate what they can. But if they are, they still have to be protected and respected that way through protocols and those type of protections. So.
Jamie, when you were on the Australian Heritage Council, Dwarranillan and the best practice standards went through. Was that a response to the fact that rights aren't being recognised for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural heritage?
I don't think it was as pointed as that. I think the idea that, or the drivers of the creation of Dwarranillan, which in Ngunnawal language, I think, remembering country. Is that right, Matt? And it's a vision that's been adopted by the Commonwealth Government as a framework to protect and manage and envision for First Nations heritage, both tangible and intangible heritage, and how it should be viewed from not just First Nations people, but as a collective society here in Australia. I think one of the really interesting principles, or one of the principles that I've kind of really think that resonates and should resonate with all Australian citizens, is that First Nations heritage, whether it be tangible or intangible, is not only our heritage, it's the heritage of all Australians. And I think that the separation between the two, we're the custodians of it, and we should be being able to manage it and protect it, and being able to hand that down to generations to come, as it has done for centuries now. But the value that it projects with all Australian citizens is something that there's still a gap there. And I think that plays out. We've been talking about the shortfalls within law and legislation, and how I guess whether it be other lobbying bodies or political parties don't recognise the value of First Nations heritage more collectively, and it's something that we've been kind of trying to push, and where the national list can actually play a significant role in facilitating the conversation around First Nations heritage and how that fits into the Australian kind of landscape and narrative of the Australia of the last 130 odd years, 230 odd years, let alone the last 60,000 years. We've still got a long way to go as a nation to actually bring those together. And until we kind of can get there as collectively, I think that we'll always have, situations which happened here, some 12 months ago with the repeal of the legislation. We'll still continue to have debates in and around, the value of heritage. And I think also just on the other side of this, and then us having the kind of housing facilities to actually manage our own heritage as well. And because it's lack of a better term, a little bit loose at the moment, where, Gareth pointed out, he's the CEO of a prescribed by the corporate, which is, charged through the Native Title Act to manage their native title rights, and then the extension of that heritage, etc. Like, how are they meant to manage that effectively when there's only one individual actually employed? So there's, they haven't got the ability to create a database and kind of house their own information from a data sovereignty perspective. So then when people come to country, they say, hey Gareth, can you kind of, point us, navigate us in the right direction? Like the capacity for us to be able to do that there's a lot of shortfalls at the moment.
All while there's no actual mandate to hold the government to account. And that's the whole issue. Like there's funding for different projects, like Jamie's pointing out with data sovereignty and databases and different things, but that's not the same as creating a framework for a strategy to be created into a policy that can go into a bill, into legislation to protect that formally for us to point to, and that's just all down to the UNDRIP treaty really at the end of the day.
And until this is addressed by all Australian governments, you'll continue to get situations which is playing out within the political arena and within the media, within the Orange situation. That this will continue to happen, and until communities are actually empowered to be able to do this, you'll always have this separation of views. So it's pretty difficult to get. Interestingly, corporate Australia actually get it. And in my dealings with corporate Australia, they're kind of a bit more advanced and actually dealing in the relationships and valuing the heritage, whether it be tangible, intangible, for First Nations people. But when you kind of get to kind of government houses, they just kind of falls away a little bit. I was just spent the week on a few sites, one 2 hours south of where we are now, and I was up in the Pilbara on Thursday. And it's really interesting, the relationships and the value that, the people that are actually working on site and on country kind of give to the First Nations people there. And I think when the mind's away in Canberra or in Perth or in these capital cities, it kind of doesn't filter through to actually, because they're not working in the space. So from a cascading effect, the role of the Australian Heritage Council in the listings, for First Nations listings there, from a national perspective, we need to tell the Australian story, and to get Australians on board to actually valuing the intangible nature of Australia and not be kind of shy of it. And I think that's part of if you look back at the Juukan disaster 4 years ago, it was obvious, it's glaring obvious that the people that were putting the explosives and knowing that was there, they just didn't value it, or they didn't value it enough to say, hey, this is the wrong thing to do. And I think that's one of the things that's played out now, and as we're trying to advocate for law reform, that we need to kind of bring that forward.
Yeah, thank you. Now, we've got a bit of time for questions.
Hi panel, Richard Mackay and thanks. I'd just like to press a bit further on the roles and responsibilities. We have UNDRIP, we have the ICIH convention not ratified. We hope we're about to have an international charter setting practice standards. And then I come back home and think, well, we've got the Indigenous head of power, or the Aboriginal head of power in section 51 of the Constitution, and yet all our property and heritage management legislation is state and territory based. In an ideal world, noting that we've got a government that says it is committed to Indigenous heritage reform, how does it play out? Does the Commonwealth actually take the lead and try and do a sort of companies code thing and say, look, we will actually have a national set of legislation? Or do we continue to have this piecemeal approach across 9 different jurisdictions where basically it's all a recipe for how to get permission to destroy stuff? Matthew and Jamie, or Gareth, I guess.
I'll just say that, those principles are totally inconsistent with government policy at the moment, whether that's Commonwealth or state, and I don't think there's any hope at all in the near future for us anyway. Like the content does exist, it is available, it is accessible for us to share and incorporate into whatever the project is, but until that can be protected and respected in the right way. It's just, yeah, it's going to be a piecemeal approach.
You know, the Charter was apparently taking 20 years to develop. Commonwealth Indigenous Cultural Heritage Law was first passed as an interim measure in 1984, and so we have now been at that for 40 years trying to get the reform. And when you think about when it was initially passed in 1984, it was interim legislation. It was part of the wreckage of the failed National Land Rights Project that was largely derailed by the Western Australian mining industry, but we've moved on. And it was part of that attempt by the Commonwealth to cover the field. And in some of the submissions I've written and the work we've done, we've said, well, that has a desirability about it, but there's also a fundamental reality in this country that the states manage land. You know, and this is one of the difficulties with native title and PBCs, that the states are the land managers and PBC are a land management organisation, but the states will tell you, well, they're a federal creation, so we're not going to fund them, and the feds will say, well, it's a land management thing, so we're not going to fund them. There is a fundamental reality that the way the colonies developed, the states owned the land in right of the Crown, and cultural heritage, in place-based cultural heritage we're talking about, is a feature of land management. And so while I might have views about the desirability of having overall Commonwealth legislation, I think there's a reality that Indigenous cultural heritage management, all cultural heritage management, is part of land management, and that's a state responsibility. And if you follow that through, though, obviously the states have failed in their responsibility to effectively protect cultural heritage, all cultural heritage, but in this context, Indigenous cultural heritage. And so there is a role for the Commonwealth to play, which is similar to ATSIPA, but clearly that legislation, we keep on saying ATSIPA, and I forget not, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act, ATSIPA, that legislation has failed, and that's been acknowledged by, you know, any number of inquiries. Yes. So I think we're inevitably in a situation, and the Western Australian debacle, as I describe it, was illustrative of this. We're inevitably in a situation where there is going to be state legislation, but there does need to be a better Commonwealth overlay. And my hope is that if you get a strong, effective Commonwealth overlay, it'll actually be the proponents that are going to the states to say, you know, one thing any proponent hates is dual regulation. And so if you've got effective Commonwealth legislation that can be called on by traditional owners to protect their cultural heritage, and you've got a different approach being taken by the states that is undesirable, and so state, it's up to you to align your legislation with the Commonwealth legislation so that there's a uniformity and a simplicity in the regulatory approach. And I think that, Richard, that's the only way we can overcome the sort of problems of historical federalism.
Yeah, just further to some of Matt's points there. So, yeah, ATSIPA was introduced in '84, and it was kind of in the middle of the kind of whole land rights movement. We had, you know, land rights legislation being passed in the NT and also within New South Wales. It was pre-native title. So as we all know, we're 30 years down the track of native title. And so it didn't speak to these other pieces of legislation. I spoke about the tapestry of kind of statutory bodies and whatnot. So it doesn't fit at the moment. And that's why you are, and I'm coming back to the collective rights conversation, you are getting individuals exercising their rights a lot of the times through ATSIPA. And we know there's been 615 odd ATSIPA applications. There's been a spike in those. And most of those ATSIPA applications are from individuals. And so I could put in a heritage protection Section 10 application over this country here. It's not my country, so I've got no real kind of rights to it. But so it's not my, although I'm a resident here and part of the WA community, I'm not the custodian of the heritage, particularly First Nations heritage that exists in whether it be Perth or WA more broadly. My rights and recognitions belong back home on my country, and I exercise those through the collective decision-making of our prescribed body corporate down there. So I just wanted to kind of give some kind of colour, further colour to that. And so the ATSIPA, the Commonwealth legislation, just doesn't speak to any of that at the moment. And so when we first embarked on the kind of the journey, the kind of, I'm not sure how many attempts, there's been several kind of full close attempts that, got close to kind of ICIP reform. The biggest attempt, I think, was maybe about early 2000s, I think, Matt?
Yeah, they actually got something into the Senate.
Yeah, that's right. And as we're kind of like now on this 4-year journey with the Commonwealth, it was first contemplated that, yeah, okay, the states aren't doing a great job, the Commonwealth should just take over the game, and then at least we get some consistency, and with the shortfalls of of course state legislation, we get some consistency across the board, and there's some certainty there. This cross kind of border. You know what you're dealing with, whether you be dealing with in Queensland or WA, and of course the states being the kind of the land managers, they didn't like that, yeah, and of course also there would have been some complications in managing heritage through Canberra, and that would have been like almost disastrous and created more problems to actually problems that will resolution of other issues. It was also contemplated that the Commonwealth introduces to the standards, and I think this is what your point was, Matt, and then raising the bar, and if you don't reach the standards, the Commonwealth actually steps in and manages heritage in your turf, for various different reasons that kind of didn't fly either. So we've kind of pivoted to enhancing ICIP legislation, where I guess inadvertently it would create a set of standards that would raise the bar of all state and territory legislation. But you can imagine with the federation of all the jurisdictions, the other interest groups, farmers, other industry groups, that this is like a freight train that you need to be able to turn around and go the other way. So it's complex. And I think, like coming back to my earlier point around the kind of values of heritage, it's interesting when you speak to industry and others, they're like, oh yeah, we're valuing this because we're already doing it, but we don't want it legislated because we just want to kind of manage it ourselves, yeah? We want it relatively unregulated, we're taking care of business. And for the most part they are, and you kind of get your outliers, which are kind of, doing not necessarily, they haven't got great practice, yeah? So industry standards going to be really important through this as well, and that's why we've got the Darren Nillen Business Initiative guides as well. So in the absence of, adequate law, we can kind of also push it from an ESG perspective that, tangible heritage is actually protected and companies are doing the right thing.
Just a very, very quick comment. I mean, great question, great responses. If the Commonwealth doesn't take the lead, given that Indigenous and First Nations peoples are ready and pushing and, this has been a long time coming. If the Commonwealth doesn't do it, who is going to do it? The idea of it happening state by state just seems exhausting to an old person like me. We've been watching and waiting for a very long time. For those other older people in the room who remember the Australian Heritage Commission way back when, there was Commonwealth leadership and innovation and kind of bright sparks in the field. And may that happen again. I don't know that the international charter will trigger that, but maybe we can use it. People in this room, Australia ICOMOS as an organisation, what can we use to trigger some further discussion and change?
One very quick question. Oh, yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew, for bringing Mexico to the point, because I want to illustrate the case. Right after this, I'm going to the museum because we're celebrating Day of the Dead, which is a tradition that is from Mexico, and now it seems to be like taken everywhere, but it's a Mexican intangible, actually. So for me, it's where we gather, where community gathers, where the values are and reside, and by performing our rituals, that's where the intangible values are, right? That's one thing. And the other thing I wanted to mention is like that law that you mentioned about Mexico, the federal law for intangible cultural values of all Indigenous and Afro-Mexicans, because just 5 years ago we recognized that we have African people in Mexico, passed in 2022. It's a federal law, where anyone can register intangible values with the caveat that you have to be Mexican. So I want to bring the discussion even higher, saying like, shouldn't it be like looking into humanity values, given, for example, that a lot of these values are shared now or adopted elsewhere? And I understand that there's like the ownership issues that we have to talk about as well and disentangle. But given that I am a migrant living in a different country, adopting some of those cultures, sharing some of my culture as well, I'm thinking, isn't it a better place to say more of a humanity or universal values rather than specific laws to specific things? Because I feel like anyone in Mexico who wants to register a value, why does it have to be a Mexican born and you have to present your passport to register the values?
I hadn't contemplated the specific issue, but just on the Mexican legislation, I do know it includes provision for negotiation of outcomes between Indigenous communities about the ownership. So it's very similar. I mean, it's not identical, obviously, because the traditional owner structures are quite different, but the same issues that we're talking about in the Commonwealth ICIP legislation are coming out. Coral, I mean, it raises that, and you're all heritage professionals, so it's stuff you work with the whole time. I was mentioning the patronymy of the nation. Of course, you know, this is that cultural heritage of mankind. We've got to move past that language, don't we? The cultural heritage of mankind, but it does raise to me interesting intellectual and therefore practical issues about what do you do, and it's something Jamie and I have discussed. You know, if a traditional owner group said, well, we're happy with the arrangement that's made, we do know it's going to negatively impact on our cultural heritage, but it provides significant benefit for the community, and so we want this deal to go ahead, and the nation says, but this cultural heritage is cultural heritage for the nation. We can't let it be destroyed. And of course, you know, that's similar to the usual debate about property and cultural heritage, and can a property owner destroy the English castle I was talking about. And it's always posed as such a wicked problem, but, you know, similarly to a lot of Indigenous ownership of resources generally, the problem is really that the state won't stump up the money. You know, because that's what it comes to. So if we look at traditional owners and greenhouse gas projects, you know, some of the Northwest Gas, and the opposition to that, well, no traditional owner, and, you know, I can on this base, no traditional owner would prefer to see their cultural heritage smashed up than not. So the issue is actually the country. I mean, if the country is asserting a right to protect cultural heritage, well, the country should come up with the resources to protect it and not impose the cost on traditional owners. And that, to me, seems to be the issue. And I suppose similarly on a universal basis.
Yeah, and that's happening with us. I guess if there was a senior Bardi man sitting here today and their culture was at risk, because they know who they are, they know that they're qualified, that they're still practicing culture, but if that's at risk, they've got nothing. They're the last couple of centuries and beyond, it just disappears into nothing, and that's what we're obviously trying to avoid.
Well, thank you to everyone. We're out of time, so I'd like us to thank our speakers.